The auction block stood in the center of Milledgeville, Georgia, on a Tuesday morning in April of 1846. It was made of rough-hewn pine, elevated 3 feet above the packed earth, weathered by sun and rain and the passage of countless souls sold into bondage. The crowd that morning numbered perhaps 70 men, planters and overseers and speculators, all gathered for the estate sale of Colonel Mucka's Punton, deceased. The auctioneer was a man named Sullers Wubb, known throughout Middle Georgia for his clear voice and his ability to extract top dollar for human merchandise. He'd already sold 16 people that morning, families torn apart, children separated from mothers, the usual brutality conducted with businesslike efficiency. But when the 17th lot was brought forward, when the woman was led onto that pine block, something in the atmosphere changed. The crowd went silent. Not the anticipatory silence before bidding begins, but something deeper, something that felt like recognition and dread mixed in equal measure. The woman stood perfectly still, her eyes downcast, her posture suggesting neither defiance nor submission but a quality that one witness would later describe as absence, as if she were present physically but removed in some fundamental way. Wubb opened his mouth to begin his pitch, to describe her age and abilities and breeding potential. But the words caught in his throat. He stood frozen for a moment that stretched too long, staring at her with an expression of confusion and growing horror. Then he stumbled backward off the auction block, fell hard to the ground and began screaming that his eyes were burning, that something was wrong with his eyes, that he couldn't see right anymore. 2 men pulled him away. The woman remained on the block motionless, while the crowd dispersed without a single bid being offered. Within a week, 3 men who'd been in attendance that morning were dead. Within a month, Sullers Wubb had lost his vision completely. And the woman, whose name was recorded in the estate inventory as Delphine, disappeared from all official records as if she'd never existed at all. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? To understand what happened at that auction in Milledgeville, we need to go back further, back to the origins of the Punton plantation, and the family that built it on land that the Creek Nation had occupied for centuries before removal. Mucka's Punton's grandfather, Josiah, had purchased the property in 1798, 600 acres of river bottom land that was fertile beyond measure, and according to Creek oral tradition, cursed beyond redemption. The Creek had avoided settling that particular tract despite its obvious agricultural value. Their stories spoke of the land as hungry, as taking more than it gave, as being inhabited by something that had been there long before human arrival, and that resented human presence with patient malevolence. Josiah Punton heard these warnings from the few remaining Creek families in the region and dismissed them as superstition, as primitive fear of perfectly good farmland. He built his main house on a slight rise overlooking the river, constructed slave quarters and barns and all the infrastructure of plantation agriculture, and set about making his fortune. For the first 5 years, everything prospered. Crops came in abundant. The enslaved population remained relatively healthy. Josiah's wife bore him 3 sons. The Punton family established themselves among the planter elite of the region. Then, in 1803, things began to go wrong in ways that duffed natural explanation. The first sign was the stillbirths. In a single month, 7 women in the slave quarters delivered babies that were born dead, each one showing the same peculiar deformity, eyes that were fully formed but completely black, no whites, no iris, just darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The plantation midwife, a woman named Ruth who delivered hundreds of healthy babies in her 40 years, refused to attend any more births on Punton land. She told Josiah's wife Sarah that something was wrong with the soil, that it was getting into the water and the food, that it was changing things before they could even be born. Josiah dismissed this as foolishness and threatened Ruth with punishment if she didn't return to her duties. Ruth ran away that night, disappeared into the woods, and was never recovered despite extensive search efforts. The stillbirths continued sporadically for the next decade, always with those same lightless eyes, always leaving the mothers traumatized in ways that went beyond normal grief. Joseph Punton died in 1814, kicked in the head by a horse that had never shown aggressive behavior before and never would again, as if the animal had been seized by momentary madness specifically to deliver that fatal blow. His eldest son, Macabre, inherited the plantation at age 26 and immediately implemented changes designed to increase profitability. He expanded the cultivated acreage, purchased additional enslaved workers, drove everyone harder toward greater production. Macabre was a harder man than his father, more willing to use violence to maintain control, less concerned with the welfare of those he owned. Under his management, the plantation became more profitable but also more oppressive, the quarters becoming a place of constant fear, where punishment was arbitrary and brutality was routine. And it was during Macabre Punton's tenure that Delphine first appeared in the plantation records, purchased in 1832 from a slave trader who wouldn't meet Macabre's eyes when he handed over the bill of sale, and who left the property as quickly as his horse could carry him. The bill of sale listed Delphine as age 14, origin unknown, special qualities none. The price Macabre paid was absurdly low, a fraction of what a healthy young woman would normally cost. The trader, when pressed about this, said only that the girl came from South Carolina, that she'd been part of an estate settlement, and that Macabre would understand the low price once he'd kept her a while. Macabre, thinking he'd gotten a bargain, assigned Delphine to field work and didn't think much more about it. But the other enslaved people on the plantation noticed her immediately and reacted with unease that gradually intensified into fear. They said there was something wrong about her, something that went beyond the visible, something that made them uncomfortable in ways they struggled to articulate. She didn't speak, which wasn't unusual for traumatized individuals, but her silence had a quality that felt deliberate, as if she was choosing not to speak rather than being unable to. She worked adequately but mechanically, following instructions without comprehension showing in her eyes, moving through tasks as if her body remembered them but her mind was elsewhere. And people avoided her when possible, gave her wide berth in the quarters, wouldn't eat food she'd touched, wouldn't sleep near where she slept. The first incident that brought Delphine to Macabre Punton's direct attention occurred in 1833. The plantation overseer, a man named Dutch Carter who was known for his cruelty, even in an environment where cruelty was normalized, attempted to rape Delphine behind one of the tobacco barns. What happened next was witnessed by 3 people who all gave consistent accounts despite being interviewed separately. Carter grabbed Delphine, threw her against the barn wall, began tearing at her clothing. Delphine didn't resist physically, didn't fight or struggle. She simply looked at him, made direct eye contact in a way enslaved people were trained never to do with white men, held his gaze while he continued his assault. And then Carter started screaming. He released her and stumbled backward, clutching at his face, yelling that she'd done something to his eyes, that everything looked wrong, that the world had gone dark even though the sun was still shining. The witnesses said Delphine simply straightened her clothing, looked once more at Carter with those dark, unblinking eyes, and walked away. Carter was found 3 hours later, curled in a ball in the same spot, whimpering. He never recovered his sanity. Macabre had him committed to an asylum in Milledgeville where he died 6 months later, the official cause listed as acute mania with persistent visual disturbances. Macabre Punton, hearing about this incident, should have sold Delphine immediately. A slave who could somehow harm a white man was too dangerous to keep, regardless of how the harm was inflicted. But Marcus was a stubborn man and also a curious one. He wanted to understand what had happened, wanted to know if Delphine had somehow poisoned Carter or if something else was at work. He had her brought to the main house for questioning. This was the first time he looked at her directly, the first time he met her eyes. He would later write in his private journal, discovered after his death, that meeting Delphine's gaze was like looking into a well that had no bottom, that her eyes held depths that shouldn't be possible in human features, that staring into them made him feel like he was falling even though he remained standing still. But Marcus had trained himself to maintain control in all situations. He questioned Delphine about Carter, about what she'd done to him. She didn't respond, didn't acknowledge his questions in any way. Marcus, frustrated, raised his hand to strike her. Delphine's eyes flickered toward his raised hand. Marcus felt his arm go numb from shoulder to fingertips. The numbness lasted for 3 days and then vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. Marcus never attempted to strike her again. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Over the next 13 years, Delphine remained on the Pendleton plantation in a status that was both enslaved and somehow separate, as if the normal rules didn't quite apply to her. She was assigned light work, kept away from the other enslaved people as much as possible, housed in a small cabin by herself at the far edge of the quarters. Marcus visited her occasionally, not for sexual purposes. He seemed genuinely afraid to touch her, but to talk. He would sit outside her cabin and speak to her about plantation business, about his frustrations and fears, about his growing sense that the land itself was hostile to him. Delphine never responded, never gave any indication she heard or understood. But Marcus continued these one-sided conversations as if her silent presence provided some form of comfort or counsel. Other enslaved people avoided Delphine's cabin entirely, wouldn't walk past it after dark, claimed that lights could be seen through the cracks in the walls even when no candle or lamp was lit inside. They said they heard her speaking sometimes in the deep night, not in English or any African language anyone recognized, but in sounds that hurt to listen to, that made people's teeth ache and their vision blur. The stillbirths that had plagued the plantation since its founding stopped completely after Delphine's arrival. This should have been seen as positive, but the enslaved community understood it differently. They believed Delphine had absorbed whatever darkness was causing the deformities, had taken it into herself somehow, was carrying it in ways that made her both protected and dangerous. The old women in the quarters, the ones who remembered African traditions and who understood things beyond Christian teaching, said that Delphine wasn't entirely human, that she was what they called a vessel, someone born to contain something that shouldn't exist in the physical world, someone whose entire existence was defined by carrying a burden she'd never chosen. These women treated Delphine with wary respect, left offerings of food and water outside her cabin, performed small rituals meant to appease whatever dwelt within her. Delphine never acknowledged these offerings, never showed awareness of the rituals, but the offerings always disappeared by morning, and the rituals always seemed to produce calm afterward, as if something was satisfied by the attention. Marcus Pendleton's journal, which covered the years 1835 through 1846, provides the most detailed account of his observations regarding Delphine. He wrote about her frequently, with a mixture of fear and fascination that increased over time. In 1837, he noted that Delphine didn't seem to age, that she looked exactly as she had when he'd purchased her 5 years earlier, while enslaved people of similar age were showing normal signs of time's passage. In 1839, he documented an incident where Delphine had been working in a field during a thunderstorm and had been struck by lightning. Other workers saw it happen, saw the bolt hit her directly, saw her collapse. They ran to help, expecting to find her dead. But Delphine stood up before they reached her, brushed herself off, and returned to work as if nothing had occurred. The only evidence of the strike was a pattern burned into the ground around where she'd been standing, a pattern Marcus sketched in his journal, a circular design that resembled symbols he'd seen in books about occult practices, though he claimed no knowledge of such things. In 1841, Marcus wrote that he'd begun to fear Delphine, that her continued presence on the plantation felt like living with a loaded weapon that could discharge at any moment. But he also wrote that he couldn't bring himself to sell her, that something prevented him from taking that action, that whenever he considered it, He felt a dread so profound it made him physically ill. He described this as being trapped, as having made a mistake years ago that he now couldn't undo, as being bound to Delphine by forces he didn't understand. His wife Sarah, who'd been peripherally aware of the strangeness surrounding Delphine, began having nightmares in the early 1840s. She dreamed of the slave quarters burning, of smoke that carried faces, of Delphine standing unharmed in the center of destruction while everything around her was consumed. Sarah begged Marcus to sell Delphine, to send her away before something terrible happened. Marcus promised he would but never did. In 1844, Sarah Pendleton died of what the doctor called brain fever, but what Marcus privately suspected was terror, the accumulated weight of living for 12 years in proximity to something that shouldn't exist wearing away at her sanity until her mind simply gave up. Marcus Pendleton himself died in March of 1846, found in his study with no apparent cause of death. The doctor who examined him noted that Marcus's eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling, that his expression suggested he'd seen something that frightened him beyond capacity to process. The doctor listed the cause as heart failure, which was technically accurate in that Marcus's heart had stopped, but which explained nothing about why a healthy man of 58 would suddenly die with that look of terminal horror on his face. Marcus's will called for the plantation to be sold, the proceeds divided among his 3 surviving children who'd all left Georgia years before and who wanted nothing to do with the property. The estate auction was scheduled for April 15, 1846. Delphine, now officially 28 years old though she still appeared no older than she had at 14, was inventoried along with the other property to be sold. She was assigned a lot number. The auctioneer was briefed on what to say. Everything proceeded normally until she was actually brought forward, until men looked at her directly, until the reality of what they were being asked to purchase became unavoidably clear. Silas Webb, the auctioneer, recovered from his initial blindness to some degree, though he never regained full vision. He was interviewed 6 months later by a journalist from the Milledgeville newspaper who was writing about unusual occurrences in the region. Webb described what happened on the auction block in halting, frightened words. He said that when he looked at Delphine, when he really looked at her, he saw something behind her eyes, something that looked back at him with awareness that was ancient and malevolent and completely inhuman. He said it felt like being noticed by something vast, something that existed on a scale that made human concerns irrelevant, something that had waited a long time and could wait longer still. He said his vision didn't just fail. It was taken, specifically and deliberately, as punishment for attempting to sell what shouldn't be sold. When the journalist pressed for more details, Webb refused to elaborate, said only that some things shouldn't be discussed, that talking about them gave them power, that he'd learned his lesson and wouldn't make the mistake of speaking her name again. The 3 men who died after attending the auction all perished in ways that seemed natural but were statistically improbable in their timing. The first, a planter named Cyrus Holt, drowned in a creek barely 2 feet deep, found face down in water that shouldn't have been sufficient to kill him. The second, a slave trader named Bill Machin, was killed when his wagon overturned on flat straight road in perfect weather, crushed beneath wheels that somehow rolled backward over him despite the terrain offering no reason for such movement. The third, a young man named Thomas Whitfield who'd attended the auction with his father, died in his sleep at age 23, no apparent cause, just stopped breathing sometime in the night and didn't start again. The common factor among all 3 was that they'd been part of a group that had approached Delphine after the auction was halted, had gotten close to her, had discussed among themselves what her story might be, what might make a slave unsellable. They'd speculated that she was diseased or mad or cursed. They'd laughed about it, made crude jokes. None of them laughed for very long afterward. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The question of what happened to Delphine after the failed auction has no clear answer in official records. The Pendleton estate sale was completed for all lots except her. She simply vanished from documentation at that point, as if the record keepers collectively decided that acknowledging her continued existence was too dangerous. But unofficial accounts, stories passed down through both white and black communities in Middle Georgia, suggest she didn't go far. Multiple sources from the late 1840s describe a woman matching Delphine's description living in the woods near the abandoned Pendleton plantation, which no one had been willing to purchase after Marcus's death. She was seen occasionally by hunters or travelers, always alone, always silent, always in places that felt wrong somehow, clearings where vegetation grew in strange patterns, creek bends where the water ran dark even when it should have been clear. People who encountered her reported the same sensation Sela's Webb had described, the feeling of being noticed by something that existed on a scale beyond human comprehension, the sense that looking at her too directly was dangerous in ways that bypassed physical harm and went straight to something more fundamental. The abandoned Pendleton plantation became a place of legend in the region, a location people avoided without quite remembering why, a section of map that travelers learned to route around. The buildings collapsed gradually through neglect and weather. The fields went fallow, reverted to forest. Within 20 years, barely any trace remained that the plantation had ever existed except for some foundation stones and the family cemetery, which was maintained minimally by distant relatives who never visited in person. But the stories persisted. Stories of lights in the woods where the old quarters had stood, lights that moved with purpose, that seemed to be searching for something. Stories of voices heard at night, not words but sounds that preceded language, utterances that made listeners feel profound unease. Stories of a woman who didn't age, who walked the boundaries of the old property as if guarding it or trapped by it, who looked at those who ventured too close with eyes that held depths no human eyes should contain. In 1863, during the Civil War, a unit of Union soldiers camped on the former Pendleton land while conducting raids through Middle Georgia. The unit's commanding officer, Captain James Mitchell, kept a detailed diary that's now housed in a military archive in Washington. Mitchell wrote that the men refused to sleep in certain areas, claimed they felt watched, claimed they saw a woman in the trees who vanished when they approached. One private, a man named Edward Stokes, went missing during the night. He was found 3 days later, 10 miles from camp, curled in a hollow tree, unable to speak, his eyes open but unseeing. He never recovered, was eventually discharged as unfit for service, spent the rest of his life in an asylum. Before he lost the ability to communicate, Stokes told Mitchell that he'd followed the woman, had been trying to determine if she was a Confederate spy, had gotten close enough to see her face. He said her eyes had no bottom, that looking into them was like looking into the space between stars, that he'd felt something reach out from that darkness and touch his mind, and that touch had broken something inside him that couldn't be repaired. The stories continued through Reconstruction and into the late 19th century. A freedmen's community established itself a few miles from the old Pendleton property in the 1870s. The elders in that community, many of whom had been enslaved in the region and remembered the stories about Delphine, warned the younger generation not to go near the old plantation grounds, not to acknowledge the woman if they saw her, not to meet her eyes under any circumstances. They explained that Delphine had been a vessel, that she carried something that had been placed in her bloodline generations ago, possibly in Africa before the slavers came, possibly even before that in places whose names were lost. They said this thing she carried had protected her from the worst of slavery's horrors, but at a cost that made her existence a form of suffering beyond what physical bondage inflicted. They said she was both prisoner and guard, containing something that wanted release but that would destroy whatever it touched if freed. In 1892, a folklorist from the University of Georgia traveled through the region collecting local legends and came across the Delphine story. He interviewed several elderly people who claimed to remember the auction, who swore that everything they said was true, that the woman had been real and the things she could do were real, and the fear she inspired was absolutely justified. The folklorist, a man named Dr. Raymond Chase, was skeptical but thorough. He researched property records, estate documents, newspaper archives, trying to verify the basic facts. He found the Pendleton estate inventory, found Delphine listed by name, found documentation of the failed auction. But he also found something else. Going back through earlier records, tracing the ownership history of people sold in Georgia during the first half of the 19th century, Dr. Chase discovered that the name Delphine appeared periodically, always describing a female of unknown origin, always sold at unusually low prices, always disappearing from records shortly after purchase. The descriptions were too similar to be coincidence. Same age range, same distinctive appearance, same unsettling qualities that made buyers uncomfortable. Chase theorized in his published work that Delphine might have been a designation rather than a name, a label applied to a certain type of enslaved person who exhibited abnormal characteristics, though he couldn't explain why these characteristics would be consistent across different individuals over decades. But Chase's published theory avoided what his private notes suggested. Those notes, discovered after his death in 1924, revealed that Chase had come to believe Delphine was a single individual who'd existed for far longer than any human lifespan should allow, who'd been sold repeatedly over decades without aging, who'd been passed through the slave trade as a curse that owners wanted to be rid of as quickly as possible. Chase had tracked the name back to 1798, to a sale in Charleston, South Carolina, where a girl described as 14 years old named Delphine was purchased by a planter named Michael Goins. Goins died 6 months later under mysterious circumstances. Delphine was sold again, and again, and again. A trail of sales and early deaths and unexplained incidents stretching back to the earliest records of American slavery. Chase's notes posed a question he never dared ask publicly. If Delphine had been 14 in 1798 and still appeared 14 in 1846, what did that suggest about what she was? And if she didn't age normally, if she somehow existed outside normal time, was she still out there somewhere, still carrying whatever burden had been placed on her, still walking through a world that had changed dramatically around her while she remained constant? If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The 20th century brought new attention to the Delphine story, as historians became more interested in documenting the realities of slavery, beyond the sanitized narratives that had dominated previous scholarship. A researcher named Dr. Evelyn Moss conducted extensive oral history interviews in the 1930s with elderly African Americans in Georgia, many of whom were the last generation born into slavery. Several of her subjects, recorded on primitive wax cylinders that still exist in archive collections, mentioned Delphine without being prompted, described her as a legend among enslaved people, as a story parents told children about someone who'd found a way to survive that was both more and less than survival. One woman, recorded in 1934 when she was 98 years old, claimed her grandmother had known Delphine personally, had been enslaved on a neighboring plantation in the 1830s, had encountered Delphine at a gathering where enslaved people from different properties were allowed to interact. This grandmother had told her granddaughter that Delphine carried the accumulated pain of generations, that her bloodline had been cursed somewhere far back in time by people who'd sought to create a vessel that could contain and transport suffering without being destroyed by it. The purpose of such a vessel wasn't clear, perhaps religious, perhaps magical, perhaps something that predated such categories. But the result was a person who couldn't die normally, who aged impossibly slowly, who had to carry an ever-increasing burden of absorbed trauma and pain until something released her or until she reached some kind of critical threshold. The Pendleton property, by the 1920s, had been completely reclaimed by forest. The few people who remembered exactly where it had been were elderly, and their knowledge would die with them. but the land itself seemed to retain some quality that made it noticeable. Hunters avoided it, said game wouldn't enter the area, said their dogs refused to follow trails that led in that direction. The few people who did venture into that section of woods reported feelings of intense sadness, of grief so profound it felt physical, of being surrounded by accumulated sorrow that had no source but filled the air like humidity. Some reported seeing a figure among the trees, always at a distance, always alone, a woman who moved through the forest as if she'd been walking those same paths for a century and would walk them for another century more. In 1968, the land where the Pendleton plantation had stood was surveyed as part of a proposed development project. The survey team, using modern equipment and historical maps, was able to identify the exact location of the former buildings. They found foundation stones, bits of brick and pottery, the normal archaeological debris of abandoned settlements. But they also found something unusual. In the area where the slave quarters had been, roughly 50 yards from where the main house had stood, they discovered a small structure built partially underground, something that hadn't appeared in any plantation records or drawings. The structure was solidly built, far more durable than the quarters themselves, constructed of stone rather than wood. Inside was a single chamber, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with walls that showed signs of having been carved with symbols. The survey team photographed these symbols but couldn't identify their origin. They appeared to combine elements from various African religious traditions with other designs that had no clear cultural attribution. At the center of the chamber was a depression in the earth, roughly human-sized, as if someone had lain there repeatedly over extended periods, wearing away the soil with the weight and heat of their presence. The development project was never completed. The construction company cited financial difficulties, but private conversations among the investors suggested that what the survey team had found disturbed them sufficiently that continuing seemed unwise. The question of what Delphine actually was, what she represented, has no definitive answer. The historical record provides fragments, glimpses, accounts that are consistent enough to suggest a real phenomenon but too strange to fit comfortably into rational frameworks. Was she a victim of some occult practice, someone transformed in childhood to serve purposes she never understood? Was she a natural mutation, a rare individual born with abilities that appeared supernatural but might have biological explanations we haven't yet discovered? Was she something older, something that predated the Atlantic slave trade and that had been captured within it, forced into a system of bondage that was merely one more constraint added to far older restrictions? The enslaved people who encountered her seemed to believe she was a vessel, but a vessel for what? Pain, as some accounts suggested. Evil, accumulated generational trauma given physical form, or something else entirely, something that human language doesn't have adequate terminology to describe. What's most disturbing about the Delphine story isn't any single incident but the pattern that emerges from accumulated accounts. Here was someone who existed within the slave system, but also somehow outside it, someone whom even slave owners feared, someone whose very presence disrupted normal social and economic relationships. She couldn't be sold successfully, couldn't be used as typical enslaved labor, couldn't be easily disposed of. She existed in a state of liminal horror, neither fully alive nor dead, neither entirely human nor something else, neither free nor truly enslaved because what constrained her went beyond any chains or laws. And this existence apparently continued for decades at minimum, possibly for more than a century, suggesting a form of immortality that was purely curse, that offered no benefits except the inability to escape through death. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The final documented reference to Delphine comes from an unexpected source. In 1992, a woman in her 70s named Clara Washington contacted a researcher at a university in Atlanta. Clara explained that her great-great-grandmother had been enslaved in Middle Georgia and had passed down stories about a woman named Delphine who carried the weight of all slave suffering, who walked through history bearing what others couldn't bear, who existed as both warning and promise. Warning that some burdens destroy those who carry them, promise that those burdens can be carried, that survival is possible even at unimaginable cost. Clara said her family had maintained a tradition of leaving offerings at crossroads near the old Pendleton property, food and water and small tokens, not to worship Delphine, but to acknowledge her, to recognize her continued existence, and the service she performed by containing whatever she contained. Clara was the last of her family to maintain this tradition. She wanted to pass the knowledge to someone before she died, wanted someone to remember, wanted Delphine's story preserved even if it couldn't be fully understood. The researcher, whose name wasn't published at her request, visited the area Clara described. She found what could have been the old Pendleton property, found forests that felt distinctly unwelcoming in ways that had no obvious cause. She left an offering as Clara had described: water, cornbread, a white cloth. She returned the next day. The offering was gone. She saw no one. But she reported, in private notes, that she felt watched the entire time she was in those woods, felt the weight of attention from something that had been observing human activity for so long that human concerns had become almost alien to it. She wrote that if Delphine still existed, still walked those woods, still carried whatever burden she'd carried for more than a century, then her continued existence was the most profound tragedy the researcher had ever encountered, a suffering so prolonged and so complete that it transcended individual experience and became something larger, something that indicted the entire system that had created it. The land where the Pendleton plantation stood remains undeveloped. It's not protected officially, not designated as historical or sacred. It simply remains unused, passed between owners who never do anything with it, who hold it for a while and then sell it for less than they paid, who never explain their decision to let it go except in vague terms about it not feeling right. The forest grows thick there. The undergrowth is dense and tangled. Paths that appear one day are gone the next, as if something rearranges the landscape to discourage visitors. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone reports seeing a woman in those woods, a woman who appears young but whose eyes suggest impossible age, who moves through the trees with perfect familiarity, who seems to belong to that place in ways that transcend normal inhabitation. These reports are rare, separated by years or decades, but they're consistent enough to suggest that something persists, that whatever Delphine was or is, she hasn't been released, hasn't escaped. Continues in that liminal state between existence and absence that defined her life in bondage, and apparently continues beyond any normal lifespan. And that brings us to the question that can't be answered, the mystery that remains after all the documentation and speculation. If Delphine still exists somewhere, still carries whatever burden was placed on her, what happens when that burden becomes too great? Is there a threshold beyond which even a vessel designed to contain suffering can't hold more? And if such a threshold exists, if Delphine someday reaches her limit, what happens to everything she's been containing? Does it dissipate harmlessly? Does it return to wherever it came from? Or does it release in ways that would make the 19th century incident seem trivial by comparison? An explosion of accumulated generational anguish that's been compressed into a single being for more than 200 years, finally finding expression in the wider world. The enslaved people who told stories about Delphine often included a warning that one day she would be released, that the vessel would break, that what spilled out would change everything. They said this not as threat but as prophecy, as inevitable future that approached with every year that passed. They said that Delphine walked toward an ending that she'd been walking toward since the beginning, that her entire existence was prologue to a conclusion that would reshape understanding of suffering and survival and the cost of bearing unbearable things. What that conclusion might be, no one could say. But they were certain it was coming, as certain as they were that Delphine would continue her walk through history until the appointed time, carrying her burden through darkness and silence until the moment when carrying was no longer possible, and something else had to happen, something none of them could imagine but all of them feared. The last word on Delphine comes from an elderly man interviewed in 2008, one of the final people to maintain the old stories through oral tradition. He said simply, "She's still out there, still walking, still carrying. And when she stops, when she finally puts down what she's been holding, that's when we'll know the bill has come due. That's when payment will be required for what was done. That's when suffering deferred becomes suffering delivered." Whether this is metaphor, prophecy, or simple storytelling is impossible to say. But it stands as fitting epitaph for a case that defies every attempt at rational explanation, that exists at the intersection of history and horror, that reminds us that some stories refuse to end, some burdens refuse to be set down, and some questions remain unanswered not because we lack information, but because the answers exist in territory that human understanding can't safely occupy.